gentlemen, join MythVision's Patreon not only to support us, but there are 72 videos that I did with Dr. Dennis R. McDonald and Richard Carrier, all on the Patreon, early access. You guys can ask personal questions when I go to interview these scholars, and you're helping MythVision grow. How are you, my friend?
Good, Derek. Good to be here. Good to see you.
Well, I'm glad you're joining me. I'm super excited to get into the information that you have gold mined for quite some time. And some of the books that you've written, I know for a fact, I haven't read them yet, all of them, but I know for a fact I'm going to love them. And I want everyone who's checking this out to get the opportunity to be on the same page. And they're all on Amazon. Some of them, are easily affordable. Others a little more hefty on the cost, How the Gospels Became History. That's the one we're going to be talking about today in this particular episode for anyone who's interested. And then, of course, you can go and follow him on Amazon. He has a blog. Go down in the description of this video. You guys can check it out. This book also, we're going to be discussing the evil creator as time goes by. You're going to want to check that out. How early Christians viewed this God and what happened here. So let's go ahead and jump deep into the water here. We've never had you on the episode here on MythVision at all. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself before we get into how the Gospels became history?
Sure. Well, I graduated from the University of Virginia in 2013 I did my work in classics and religious studies. And then I moved briefly to the College of William and Mary and Virginia Tech. I sort of did the Virginia tour. And then, of all places, I ended up in Australia. And I'm here at a place called the Institute for Religion and Critical Inquiry, which is a research institute in which basically I'm charged to write. And I basically that's what most of my time now is for, just pure research, which has been great. I hope to get back to the States at some point, but I'm really enjoying my Australian tour, and that's me.
Well, I'm glad to make your acquaintance, and I'm really happy to have you on the show. We've had tons of scholars, and I keep adding to that list of other scholars who have different ideas and why they might take certain conclusions. Next month, I'll be seeing Dale C. Allison Jr., and I'm going up to Princeton. I'll be seeing him. And of course, he has certain conclusions and draws certain ideas and would probably differ in many ways than your conclusions do off your books. So I guess we'll get right in here. And I might as well ask the question, how in the world can we be so confused over the Gospels? I mean, Christians, especially ones that came from the flavor that I did, this is literally God's word, every single jot and tittle. It's literal history. Everything listed in them really happened. How do we go from what you describe in the opening introduction of this book, How the Gospels Became History, to every single thing's literally true, where we have people grabbing snakes in church, thinking this is actually what they need to be doing, the ending of Mark, so to speak, or Paul on the island gets bit by a serpent and he survives. It's what the heck happened? Why are we not seeing these things as a combination of both myth and history, or historiography and mythography, if you will?
Well, those are big questions, Derek. Maybe the best way to start is just I actually have two books on Jesus. One was my dissertation. It was published as Jesus Deus, the early Christian depiction of Jesus as a Mediterranean God. And I guess I can tell you how my thought evolved as a sort of introduction to the myth stuff. My purpose for the Jesus Deus book was to look at what I called the literary deification of Jesus. That is, to look at how early Christians deified Jesus in their narrative descriptions of him. That is, how they portrayed him as a Greco-Roman deity. And I was really interested in, why anyone would have thought this Jewish man, apparently from Nazareth, would be viewed as a god. It's not entirely incredible that people would deify someone in the ancient world. In fact, I mean, it's not totally incredible even in our world. It seems to be happening in North Korea with some of their dictators there. So it's not a completely foreign idea, but I wanted to understand how early Christians did it in their literature, and whether there were commonalities with other classical authors in how they depicted figures as divine in their literature. So I'm not actually, in that book, I wasn't actually interested in the question of, was Jesus a god, that as a kind of theological question, but how did early Christians come to think of him that way and come to depict him in that way? As my thought kind of evolved, basically 5 years later, I published How the Gospels Became History with Yale, and this is a more philosophical book, I guess. It's interested more in the question of how do we gain access to truth and what verifies religious truth. Something that I noticed, being in both Australia and in the U.S., is that we all kind of are socialized into conflating history and truth. We think that if something happened, then it must be true. And this is like a very kind of like a primitive philosophical theory. Like, if X happened in the past, then it's true. And you'll see this used in apologetical arguments that, well, the reason because Christianity is true is because Jesus really did X, Y, and Z. He was a real man, and so on and so forth. And therefore, this shores, so the historical, so-called historical truth, shores up the religious truth. And because Jesus is on the History Channel, he's better than, say, Buddha or Zoroaster or and I always found this a very interesting characteristic of Western presuppositions. In this Australian context, just to give you a kind of example of how people don't think this way, in the so-called the Aboriginal Australian ideas, there was something called the dreaming or dream time, and these are basically the mythological apparatus of Aboriginal peoples, and it's all sorts of great stories about snakes creating the universe, and about floods, and about fires, and about all sorts of things. But you never hear these people saying that the dreaming is true because it happened. I mean, that or because it happened sometime in the past. That is that's a very stupid thing to say. The dreaming isn't true because it happened in the past. The dreaming is true because it's true, and it's what we all experience in our own dreams and in our own visions. And the idea of this, trying to be verified by history, is ridiculous. When Westerners get their hands on this stuff, they're like, "Oh, this must be historical memory of some ancient flood 15,000 years ago."
Good point.
Well, it might be, or it might not be, but that's not the point of the dreaming. And so this weird Western habit to try to say, I'm going to verify my religion by checking up on the history has always found, I've always found that a very weird connection. And what I'm trying to do in this book is sort of defamiliarize that, because whether or not you're on the far right or the far left, or you're a fundamentalist or you're a mythicist, you tend to work with that same presupposition. Either you want to prove that your religion is true because it happened in the past, or you want to prove that your religion or that somebody else's religion is not true because it didn't happen in the past.
Interesting.
But both sides have the same philosophical presupposition that religious truth can be verified by things that happened in the past. And I just noticed that this doesn't make any sense at all. That we don't even know what these people don't seem to have a clear grasp of what history is. History is and has always been a guessing game, a game of construction. There's nothing divine about history. I mean, God himself doesn't do history. It's humans who do history.
Right.
And all that we have are texts that people interpret and that people disagree on. And one of the greatest examples of this is the Gospels. The Gospels are read as history today, but the real question is, how did the Gospel writers themselves imagine what they were doing? And so
Good point.
that was the point. That was the reason why I got into how the Gospels became history.
This is really just a fascinating point to point out for people who might be interested in checking this out. I highly recommend, once again, that you get the book. It's well worth taking the time to see this. What you're explaining is exactly the conversation, and I'm not trying to be rude at all, okay, at all. I had this conversation one night with Del Martin. Okay, I had a conversation with Del Martin on the phone. He said, give me a call. We emailed, right? He didn't know me from Adam, gave him a phone call, and I said, Del, we were talking about Paul for a second. I just said, I'm trying to figure out what he meant. Like, what the heck? What was he going through? I want to know the who, what, when, where, why, that kind of stuff. Like, that's the stuff I'm interested in. I'm not worried about what a guy in 1700 stop Paul meant, or in the 1500s, what Martin Luther thinks he meant when he said justification by faith alone. Like the way he interpreted Paul. I want to know what Paul probably meant. Now, we may never know exactly what Paul meant. We have so many people on different ends. You got one guy saying he's within Judaism, one guy saying, no, he's saying the opposite of what you think he's saying. And it's like, whoa. Well, in the Gospels, with what you're doing, it seems that you're trying to do something like what I'm interested in, but at the same time, you're explaining like how maybe the authors originally didn't mean what. I guess it's like when you put something through the fire, what's going to remain is kind of what happens. And the early church fathers, correct me if I'm wrong here, are being kind of put through the fire by other people who are starting to point fingers and compete with them on these ideas. And so they're having to kind of take a strong stance with their text, if I'm not mistaken. Is this where it becomes historical, if I might ask?
Well, the argument I make in the book is that the gospel writers themselves imagine themselves as doing what ancients called historia. And that's not exactly the same as modern historiography. So there's two things I distinguish. There's the ancient historia, things that like Herodotus, if your viewers are familiar with him, things that Herodotus did is ancient historia. That is, it's not kind of modern history. It's not like archival based. It's just some guy going out and saying, I heard this story and I'm going to tell you about it. And he's going on tour to various places and he's like, I'm going to tell you another story. I don't really believe it, but I'm going to tell you it anyway. And sort of that's ancient historia. It's not the same rigorous stuff as modern historiography. And the interesting thing about ancient historia is that it can include things that the Greeks called mythoi, or for us, myth. I don't use myth in the book because it's such a politicized term. I prefer to use mythoi, which is again just the Greek there. But mythoi basically are fantastical tales and things that you wouldn't necessarily believe. But there was a movement when the Gospels were being written, a kind of literature that was being written that tried to put mythoi into the form of history. And the Greek there is en historias schemati. And we see ancient Greek authors doing this. One key example is Diodorus of Sicily. So he's a first century BCE writer, and he writes a huge multi-volume work called The Library of History. And if you look up the first 4 books of that library of history, which survive and are pretty easily accessible online, you'll see that he starts his history with what even the ancients thought of as the mythical period. That is the time of the Trojan, the stuff that happened before the Trojan War. So things like, Egyptian gods, the birth of Egyptian gods, the birth of Greek gods, the adventures of Heracles, and so on and so forth, or Hercules if you prefer. Book 4 is actually mostly about Heracles. And what Diodorus says there is, he says, I'm going to tell you about Heracles because he's a great hero. Everybody believes him. Speaking of the ancients here, everybody believes him. But what I'm going to do is, I notice that the stories about Heracles, they're all myths or mythoi, but I'm going to put them in the form of history. So I'm going to tell you the story as if it were a connected series of events. And that's how I'm going to do it. And so this form of writing ancient history, I call mythic historiography. And that is the model that I use for understanding what the gospel writers are doing. What the gospel writers have at their disposal, I think, is a series of rather fantastical tales, what others would call mythoi, and they put them into the form of history and Historia schemati. They give it a narrative, they organize it, and they also use certain tropes to give it the form of history. And some of those tropes include naming rulers of the day, or naming famous places, or bringing in so-called talking about eyewitnesses, or using very vivid language, talking in a matter-of-fact way. All these kind of techniques are known historicizing tropes that they're very intent and intelligently use to give their story this sense of being a history. But then the question is, after we've determined that's what literarily they're trying to do in their ancient context, then the question for us is it actually history? And is there anything beneath the tropes? And if that's the question that you're interested in, go for it. That's the true historical question. But what I'm more interested in is pointing out, did you notice the tropes? If you understand.
I love this. This is a great point. And, getting behind the tropes, I don't have the skill, right, to try and pretend I know what really is solid and what isn't. But what I do like in your book that you mentioned, as I briefly started getting into this, you talk about how they're using these tropes, and some of those tropes are, hey, there's a place, or there's this guy, or there's these things, and they're off by a decade or something. This is the clear indication they're not contemporary, and that they're writing this after, but also trying to do exactly what you're talking about. So the question then becomes, because your opening chapter, and I haven't been able to read it yet, but I do want to. I love to do a review on this on Amazon as well for you. You talk about mythicists. You bring up 2 other mythicists who aren't necessarily contemporaries, and you bring up one that is contemporary, is Dr. Richard Carrier. And we have a lot of fans that watch that probably don't like him. We have a lot of fans that watch who do like him. What's there not to like? You guys are all trying to do things, and you're trying to figure out what the answer is. But you talked about their approach, the mythicist approach to these texts. And what you're doing, I think, is a really interesting thing. It goes into the vein of what Dennis MacDonald was telling me that he's saying is it's like fan fiction, so to speak. But they're making it into some historical mode. You mentioned you also talk about Dennis, and I didn't know this, of his work in your book. I can't wait to read that as well. Can you tell us a little bit about the work of mythicists and where you think they've gone wrong, other than the point that you say they have a reverse philosophy, so to speak, of fundamentalism? It's just fundamentalism backwards, so to speak. What are the problems you think with that? Because I hear a lot of people make the argument against, we'll start with mythicists, maybe get to Dennis, is that they'll say stuff like if it was really mythicist, like you talked about with Herodotus, he's reaching back into an archaic time that you can't even validate or verify anything. So it's clear that Hercules is a mythos completely. Like, we don't know if there's any historical verisimilitude, but the point is, this guy's definitely way back. Why would you write something that is complete mythos that's only 60 to 100 years before you? Like, it's not that archaic. And so some people who argue against mythicists will say, yeah, that it's like not that far back. Like, this guy's somewhat in memory. You wouldn't like create this as a complete myth and he didn't exist at all. Do you agree with that, or what would you say?
Well, it's kind of funny. There's an amazing writer called Lucian of Samosata in the 2nd century, and he writes a book called How to Write History. And he's writing in the 2nd century, so not really, just a few years after the gospel writers themselves. And he opens his book and he says, you know what, I've written this book because all you other historians are complete losers, because you've taken this recent war, and it was a Persian war that the Romans sort of invaded Persia. And Lucian looked around and he noticed that all these historians popped up. And they're like, oh, I'm going to tell you the story of the great Persian war in recent times, which is just, 10 to 20 years in the past. And Lucian says, you've completely mythicized the war. I mean, you've got, all sorts of crazy crap happening, gods coming out of the sky, and like the emperor is portrayed as as a god, and we're wrapped in lightning, and I mean, you guys have totally messed this up. And this is a recent event, and
Wow.
why do ancient historians like to spice up the tale, so to speak? Because just like modern historians, they want to sell books. So I mean, it's fun. I mean, telling myths are fun. Telling mythoi are fun because they are emotive. They're fun to listen to. They're enjoyable and entertaining stories. I mean, do I really want to hear a story about the Roman emperor, eating breakfast? No, I want to hear about the Roman emperor wrapped in lightning with a sword of fire, fighting the Shah of the Shahs, and against evil Persia, which is now evil Iran. we love to get a little bit of spice. So the idea of spicing up the tale recently after the so-called events happened, everybody knows that that's what happens. That's what happened to Apollonius of Tyana. It's what happened to another figure called Peregrinus Proteus, who burned himself alive in the year 165 at the Olympic Games, and already had his mythology already set up for him. Lucian also wrote about Peregrinus, and he said, even before he leapt into the fire, he had already programmed his followers' minds to say such and such after he had died. And and lo and behold, after he burned himself and torched himself alive, he was revered as a god.
Didn't you say in your book too that he said to one of the guys who like walks by, or no, he tells the myth of this burning, and then all of a sudden he hears the lie that he told about it. He hears his own lie in his own lifetime, like come back, and he's thinking, that's made up. I made that up. And
well, yeah. So Lucian, and we don't know if he's fully joking, but
right.
Lucian says that after he saw Peregrinus burn himself, and then he was going away, and then other travelers came by, and they were like, we missed it. Did you see Peregrinus burn himself? And he's like, yeah, I did. And guess what? There was a huge vulture that came right out of the fire and spoke in a human voice saying, I'm done with earth, to heaven I fare. And then the very next day, he meets an old man in a colonnade and hears this story that he made up, repeated back to him as if it was historical fact.
Yeah, like the guy said he witnessed this as well or something, and he's like, I made this up.
I mean, it's all quite amusing, but it whether or not Lucian is telling the truth is irrelevant here. The point is that things can become mythicized lightning fast, and people can make up things like historical memories. They can make up eyewitnesses. It's very easy to make up an eyewitness. I mean, let's face it. Historical fiction, anybody who's read really good historical fiction knows that there's millions of books out there which can tell you about an event in the past as if it really happened, but the understanding is that it didn't. But it's called historical fiction because it's true to life. And anybody can write a true to life tale. It doesn't mean that it's true. I mean, I don't want to sound like an absolute skeptic, because I don't think that everything in the Gospels is some kind of concocted lie or something like that, or that they're intentionally trying to deceive people, or none of that is true. But to get back to your questions about mythicists, I talk about, in chapter 1, I talk about 3 different mythicists. There was Maurice Casey. I know this whole world of mythicists on the internet, and I'm not smart enough to keep up with all that. Actually, Maurice Casey in 2014 published a book on sort of the internet phenomena of mythicism. Right. What I wanted to do is I wanted to focus on the real scholars. So I chose Bruno Bauer, who's a 19th century German, Thomas L. Brodie, and Richard Carrier. And Richard, I like Richard. I liked Richard's book. Once he got a hold of my book, he absolutely tore it to shreds. But I have no problem with Richard personally.
He likes your book, by the way, just so you know. I don't know if he probably is criticizing the mythicist part, but he told me just recently, I saw him in California, and he said he absolutely recommends your works. He told me that, but I don't know if there's like a secret conversation that I'm not aware of.
Well, that's good. I appreciate that. But the basic thing is, what I see going on is there's a strong desire, and it's based on our Western tendencies to historicize things. That is, to imagine links, genetic links between texts and traditions. And Westerners, myself included, have this fascination with saying, "Oh, there's A, and then there's B, and I'm going to connect them." So a good example here is, Richard will say that some of the elements of Jesus's life appear in the myth of Inanna, who's a Mesopotamian deist, who is like from the 18th century BCE, goes way back. And so because there's parallels between the stories, they must somehow be genetically connected. And very similarly with Dennis MacDonald, who's brilliant in pointing out parallels between Homer or Virgil or Euripides and Mark. But this idea of parallels creating genetic connections, that's all up here. That's all mostly intuitive. And I think that it mistakes the real complexity of what's going on the ground in antiquity. It makes these gospel writers look very bookish, as if they are pulling off the shelves Homer and then rewriting sort of Homer, whereas Homer is known by everybody, and most people's interaction with Homer is not through a book. It's through plays, it's through coins, it's through sculpture. Myth is the mass media of the ancient world. Everybody knows Heracles, just as everybody today knows Superman or Batman, not because they've read comic books, but because they've seen movies, or they've seen advertisements or pictures. People might even hate the Marvel universe, but they know exactly who the Hulk is and Thor and yada, 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 because they've picked it up through the culture, and they're not trying to imitate a specific story. There's no real genetic connection saying here's text A and here's text B, and they depend on each other, and that one must be the origin of the other. That's not really how things work. The human mind is much more complex than that, and it picks up a whole variety of things. So what I like, the model that I use, which I hope is more theoretically sophisticated, is what I call dynamic cultural interaction. That is, people are the human brain. It's really about the human brain. We have amazing brain plasticity, and we are absorbing all sorts of ideas and stories and legends and uh, anything whatsoever. From today, it's from social media and TV, but in the ancient world, it was from going to plays and seeing executions and going to the theater and going to the stadium and whatnot, going to see this glorious artwork that now exists in museums. And they're picking up this stuff, and this is informing how they're writing. And they're also, I'm fairly convinced that the gospel writers have enough education so that they know, what Herodotus feels like. They're not dependent on Herodotus, but they know what kind of history he writes, because he includes mythoi in his history, and he presents the mythoi as if they happened. And he uses sophisticated rhetorical and historicizing tropes to say that it happened. Just to use your example, the idea of the gospel writers being 10 years off is in reference to Quirinius. So the most historicizing of the gospels, I think, is Luke, which I also think is the latest of the gospels, and in the canonical form, I should say.
Oh, okay.
And I think that he says that I'm not only going to tell you about Caesar Augustus, what everybody knows Caesar Augustus. I've done my homework. I'm going to tell you about the specific Syrian governor who was alive when Jesus was born, or who was reigning when Caesar was born, and that was Quirinius. So, when you read the birth narratives, you're like, wow, this guy has really done his homework. He knows the Syrian governor. He must have done research. Well, he was wrong. I mean, he was a decade off. Quirinius wasn't the governor when Jesus was born. But the fact of the matter is that it's more important to show people that you've done your homework, to list this, Syrian ruler, to give the impression of historicity. It's more important to do that than actually to be fully right. You want to give the impression of accuracy. You don't have to be fully accurate. It's the same thing with historical fiction, because very few people, if I read a historical fiction on something on the 1600s, well, how many fact checkers are out there? How many experts in the 1600s are out there
Right.
that are going to prove me wrong?
Yeah. And this field's like cluttered with scholars who have the capability of seeing the inaccurate statements that are made by gospel authors. I do think it's interesting too, just the way that you're taking this. And I mean, I definitely think that there is motifs. Dennis has convinced me that some of these motifs are there. Now, he also has said whether they're, and he says this, he thinks they're genetic, but he says whether they're genetic, they might be genetic from the culture, meaning like you're talking about, but not like through genetic through text. He's saying that's a possibility, but they're so absorbed with it that they're like, he does think that the framework of what we're seeing is based off this. Everything from the birth to, well, it depends on what gospel you're looking at, but if you're looking at like the baptism, he thinks is Athena flying down. There's that comparison to tell it, Telemachus, you are your father's son, and there's this idea, and then all the way down into the death, right? So Hector is being dragged around for 3 days. But then you also have, you would agree, I'm sure, that there's genetic to the Old Testament, though, right? I mean, like they're clearly mimetically connecting. Or do you think that's also potentially culturally lifted? Or do they have a Septuagint in front of them? Do you think they're going, okay, it is written, here, I'm going to use that.
Well, this was Thomas L. Brody's, if your readers are familiar with, or your viewers are familiar with him, this was Thomas L. Brody, who said the same thing as Dennis did, but with regard to the Old Testament. So it's you build the gospel narratives from the prophetic narratives of the Old Testament,
right?
Just as you build the gospel narratives from the Homeric narratives in the Iliad and Odyssey. And most of this isn't intuitive and despite the seeming use of criteria, I find that the criteria is often very subjectively applied and very selectively applied. But my point, to emphasize agreement, I think that I would be happy to agree with the idea that there are schema that get in our heads. For instance, I use the schema of, a resurrected individual, or an individual who goes through an incredible act of self-sacrifice, or a schema of someone rising to heaven. There are hundreds of stories of ascents. Right. There are many stories of people coming back from the dead in the ancient world.
Physical?
Sorry?
Physical death? I have to poke because there's Christians
absolutely,
out there who need to hear
absolutely
this.
Physical death. Absolutely. And in fact, because the Greeks don't really think in that's like purely spiritual as in non-material terms. Absolutely, there are people who come back physically. That's without dispute, and I talk about that in the book, and there are others who've talked about that as well. So yes, people physically coming back, people physically rising to heaven, people who are born and stars and new constellations appear. That's attested in the ancient world. That's with Mithridates VI. But and also, people born by means of a divine agent without a sexual act. Christians are very quick to say, well, yes, we know that the Greek gods had sex with mortal women, but the point with Jesus is there was no sex involved.
Yeah.
And actually, what I show is, and I adapted this from Jesus Deus, and we came back to this in How the Gospels Became History. I said, yes, the elite Greek writers are well familiar with women getting pregnant from Greek deities without a sex act. And in fact, they would be embarrassed. They're embarrassed by the fact that the gods have sex. A good Platonist doesn't think that a god has sex. And so Plutarch, when he's rewriting the story of how Plato is actually, his father is the god Apollo, says that there was no sex involved. It was a pneuma. And that is a wind. And interestingly, this word pneuma shows up in Luke's account too, that a holy pneuma will come upon you. The angel tells to Mary, and everybody translates that spirit, but it's just a wind. So you have both authors trying to say that, yes, a lady got pregnant because of a god. They're very smart. They're very elite. They don't think gods have sex, nor do they portray any sex act. So there's nothing unique about the Christian story about a virgin birth. There was a schema. So the point is not that Luke or Matthew or whoever these people really were, those are just pseudonyms basically. The point is not that they knew Plutarch, who tells us about the birth of Plato from Apollo without an act of sex. The point is that they had in their heads a basic schema of how a god should act. And a god is not like a deadbeat, dad who has sex with some lady and then disappears. Surely the gods have more subtle ways of getting a lady pregnant, and that's exactly how they think of it. But it's still physical.
Doesn't Apollonius of Tyana? Apollonius of Tyana, like supposedly, and I could be wrong about this because I've not read it myself, but his mother is in like a flowery field, and these geese fly down and surround her, and supposedly she's impregnated and gives birth or something. I don't know.
That's pneuma too, because at the end of that scene, the geese or whatever, if I'm remembering correctly, they flap their wings, and there's a gust of air, and boom, she wakes up. So I mean, they are thinking in physical ways, but it's said that Apollonius was the son of Proteus, who's the sort of the shape-shifting god. But it's never said that Proteus has sex with Apollonius's mother, and that's very important, because the Christian story of the so-called virgin birth it's very distinctive to Christianity, but it's not unique. and that's the key. But again, it's never to say that they were that the followers of Jesus were riffing on Apollonius.
You're
They
right.
didn't need to. Nobody needed to, because they already had the schema. It's like accusing me of saying, I know about the Hulk. I've never read a comic book about the Hulk, but I know the story. I mean, I know the basic story,
Right.
and I don't need to go read the comic book.
Wouldn't
I
it
don't
be
even need to
even?
go see
Wouldn't
the
it be
movies.
even like? Wouldn't even I guess be stronger than that, because in antiquity, it's not just that you didn't read the Hulk. I mean, if you're going to write in Greek, you're not just like, I heard of it through the culture. It's also there, but like you're well acquainted with it as well, especially if you're already going to be reading the Greek. So it's like they're really acquainted with these motifs. And I'm sure they've read more than just Homer. So it's in the air. They're breathing this stuff. Then I gotta probe you just a little bit to get you to jab just for a second to get your thoughts. This is
Sure.
for those who are historicists out there, and the question is, what would you say would be the big defining factor that makes you like disagree with mythicists like Richard Carrier, apart from the philosophy, if you will, or the idea that you would say they're just doing the opposite of the fundamentalist in their approach? What would you say would be the reason you think there was probably most likely a historical Jesus?
Well, that's like saying though. I want you to answer. I want you to answer the question, but I want you to answer it in the way that isn't of most interest to you. Because what I really would say is that both mythicists and historicists are a bit boring, because they're dealing with that philosophical presupposition that, well, the reason why we're interested in whether these things happened is because we want to know if they were true. And what I really want to say to these people, to both sides, is to say, why do you assume that there's a connection between what happened in the past and truth? Does your religion or your religious truth depend on what happened in the past? Is that the same for Buddhists? I mean, do they
Right.
really? Let's say the Buddha never lived. Who cares? It wouldn't make a single difference to the practice of Buddhism. And I find Christians to be idolaters who want to worship at the feet of the lady goddess history. But to answer your question in the way that you want,
Yeah, and
I
look,
would
I'm not trying to pressure you. I seriously
no,
respect. Yeah, but I like the way you're coming at this. But go ahead.
to answer it in the way that you want. I would just say it's the best hypothesis. Um, it really takes more intellectual energy to imagine a scenario where there is a myth of a deity put on a cross in outer space who then is completely historicized to become a Jew of Nazareth. It takes more intellectual energy to get there than it is simply to say that it's a fairly good hypothesis that this person lived, and that explains many of the details of the story. It explains the sort of the socio or the geography, because I mean, really, I mean, who wants to have when you look at Apollonius and you look at Pythagoras, the really thing that stands out about Jesus is that he's Jewish. I mean, nobody would imagine that. Nobody would imagine a Jewish hero. I mean, the Jews were utterly marginalized. So why would you depict him as a Jew? I mean, that would be silly. So I mean, there are certain things in the story that are what are called local color elements that just there would be no reason for someone to write historical fiction about this guy in Palestine. I mean, you'd rather choose somebody from Egypt, somebody who's a real, or somebody from Greece, or Pythagoras has a nice Italian pedigree. Apollonius is from Asia Minor. I mean, choose somebody from the center. No, we have this marginal Jew to refer to a title of a historical Jesus book, and yeah, there's a whole bunch of stuff said about him. But the best explanation for why he is who he is, a Jew who's raised in Jewish law, who reads Jewish stuff, is because he existed, and then the imagination takes it from there. I mean, and what I'm interested in is the imagination.
Right. No, I respect
I,
that. And the answer, I'm on that side of things, right? Like that's where I'm at as well. So I thought to me, it's a bit ad hoc in my mind, just trying to posit all that because maybe if we had more literature that spelled out exactly those things, we would be coming down maybe towards the other side more, in my opinion. But that's not what I think. I think what you said made a lot of sense. The takes a lot less energy to see a fan fiction mythologized character, and a lot more energy is required in order to put it in the other perspective. Even though I don't say it's not possible, I just say this makes more sense to me. But I do appreciate you answering that. I guess to go further into how the Gospels became history, you dealt with the idea of Dennis. You didn't go into too much, but the point is that you're saying you're not requiring mimetic connection. You are saying there is the connections, though. It's just not maybe mimetic. If I'm not
exactly. Yeah, you don't need mimesis. There's broadly, I mean, our brains are broadly mimetic,
right.
but the kind of mimesis that I see Dennis talking about is connecting literature to literature, and yeah, I don't think that's necessary. That's what we have as historians, and we're very bookish people. But that's yeah, the gospel writers have just, they make more and more untraceable connections, and we as historians just have to say we don't have all the data. In fact, 95% of the data we don't have.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to put you on the spot. Do you believe there was a queue?
I honestly, I don't know enough to say. I don't actually think that it's needed. I'm much more interested in a document called the Evangelion, which is Marcion's version of Luke before canonical Luke. And I think that whatever was going on in the late first and early second century was a Wild West situation. And there might have been a queue. I don't think we need it to explain the Gospels. So I'm not going to die in a ditch for that. And I think it would be. I think with I think when you're dealing with hypothetical documents, you should never base your career on that, or to make a historical argument depend on a document that we don't have. That itself is risky.
Thank you for answering these tough questions, huh? I got to ask you about this whole Evangelion thing because is it Proto-Evangelion, the Marcion's Gospel?
Nope, he just called it Gospel Evangelion. Yep.
Huh. We're going to have to get into this. Maybe we'll do that for another episode. I'll stick that to another episode. So, Dr. Litwa, as far as the Christians, and you've talked about them being idol worshippers of this thing called history as they understand it, I find beauty, and this is just me coming from my own personal where I'm at. I used to believe exactly and sat at the feet of what you talk about when you say this history. I actually now cherish the myth, if I can use that term, the mythoi, of the Gospels, now that I see them for what they really are versus what they have become in the hands of so many preachers and pastors who have this hellstone crazy message to teach you and tell you not to get vaccinated or not to do that. Like you name it. My point is they're pushing all of this using their Bible and they think that it's literal history. And I actually find beauty in that. Would you be in the same boat as me on that?
Yeah, listen, they are artistic products that are nice and fun and entertaining to read. And one of the things that makes them entertaining, one of the things that makes them literature, is that they are exquisite pieces of art. They're a little bit rough on the edges. Mark, in particular, has been known to be a rough gospel. But it is inspiring stuff, and that's why it survived. The boring stuff is the stuff that the people didn't read, which didn't survive, just like modern books today. And that's fine to acknowledge. All that I'm trying to say is exactly what you've said. If I can reword it a little bit, is that for people to uh, Christians didn't always do what I'm talking about. That is, they didn't always say, "Well, my religion is true because it's historical." If you go back to the Middle Ages and the sort of medieval readings of the Gospels, but they weren't saying that it was true because it was historical. They were using various means of allegory to explain the true meaning of the text, and all that seems like a foreign to us. Like, what in the world were they doing? But that's just how they did it, because their religion wasn't based on the idea of historical truth. It was based on getting the spiritual meaning from the text, and they thought that God was speaking to them through the spiritual or allegorical meaning. To a certain extent, that way of reading hasn't completely died. But when people get into the apologetic mode and they say, well, my religion is true because it's historical, then they start reading the Gospels as a history book. And that's where I think they're basically idolaters, or they're not realizing that the history is just their own reconstruction or somebody else's, some scholar that they've read, which has convinced them, or maybe the History Channel. But all of that is all a human product, all just a fallible reconstruction that's going to change in 5 years. So honestly, if you want to shore up your religion, don't read the Gospels as history. That's not going to do it for you. That'll make the Gospels seem outdated and bad, because we can prove that they're exceedingly bad history. The point is to read them as a spiritual text, and if you want meaning for your religion, find some other way.
I must ask one final question in this episode, if you don't mind.
Sure.
I believed Jesus died, rose, he died for 3 days, rose again from the dead, and then he ascended on high, right? Which we already know based on your works, that you show the trope. There's this motif, and it's common. This is not a exclusive idea, even though apologists want to act like everything that is die, rise again, and ascend comes after. Even though Justin Martyr would disagree with them, the point is they will argue like convoluted arguments to say all of that stuff is copying Christianity and came later, even though that's ignorant and not really factual. My point is, if they're going to read this as spiritual text, maybe I'm asking too much of you to answer this question, but the simple question is, what the author said they died, rose again. Do you think, I'll make it simple, do you think the authors who wrote, let's just start with Mark, since Matthew and Luke are using it for sure, do you think Mark believed he actually rose again from the dead literally, or what do you think with that? Because he's writing something that's a trope and it's common. Like, what's going on here? If the church's understanding of a dead man who really literally rose again and ascended on high, I don't know if there's a disconnect in my brain. Maybe you're seeing it, but the question is simply, how did this author think about Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection? Because Paul seems like he believes in a resurrected Jesus. It seems. What's going on here? I don't know. How do we connect those dots?
Well, I mean, the great tragedy would be if your viewers listened to me and thought that I was just a stuffy old professor who said that the Gospels were just a bunch of tropes. That's totally wrong. I think that the Gospel writers were very sincere, religiously minded individuals who believed that everything they wrote happened. Just as I brushed my teeth this morning, I think that that's what they believed that had happened. Now, Mark is an interesting case because, the way I think Mark ends at Mark 16:8, and so I think for Mark, he's expecting Jesus to appear in Galilee, but we don't know the nature of that appearance. It might not be physical at all. It might be in a dream. It might be something else. And then the later gospel writers are not satisfied with that, so they portray actual appearances. And then I don't know what to make with that. But I'm sure of one thing, that the ancient writers, gospel writers, believe that what they wrote was historically true, but that doesn't solve the problem for the modern person, right? because the modern person has, I mean, let's face it, times have changed. Epistemology has changed. How we view reality has changed. And how we view truth has changed. And so, but then, and then the larger question is, even if you don't think it's historically true, does that mean that your religion isn't true? No. And you should be examining your own philosophical presuppositions as to why you would be connecting historical truth, or what you think happened in the past, why you would think that that also had any impact on your modern religious beliefs. I mean, really, it doesn't matter. There's an old joke, a sort of an Easter surprise where they find the bones of Jesus in a jar somewhere, for Easter, and this is supposed to destroy Christianity. Would it? I mean, no, I'm not, in my opinion. And first of all, you could never verify that those were actually his bones. But even if in a hypothetical world you could, then the real question would be not whether Christianity is destroyed, because to my mind, resurrection would not be a hint less true. But the question then would be, why have we been fooling ourselves for all these years, depending on a historical event to shore up what we religiously believe is true? We never needed whatever it was in the past to confirm what is truth. We know what is true by other means. The same means that an Australian Aboriginal person knows that what happens in the dreaming and the dream time is true, and truer than truth itself, truer than anything physical, truer than me brushing my teeth this morning, truer in the most important of all senses, and in the most satisfying of ways. And that can only be determined by the individual, or an individual in the community who is thinking about these questions for them personally.
Sounds like the Aborigines have been ingesting some things to go to this state. Or they're in a meditate. I'm just being funny. Yeah, it sounds like when you said that if a physical resurrection didn't happen, it still could be true. That's, I think, because you're so well read, though. You're well acquainted with material outside of just reading these four Gospels. And you've seen antiquity where someone's corpse could be right there, but they still rose from the dead, because it's a different kind of resurrection, so to speak, sometimes in antiquity. And they still call it resurrection, even if it's not literal bodily. Sometimes their body, it's a different type of material or something. And there's so many stories that I didn't know at all when I was only reading it the way that I was reading it. So everyone must go get your book. I mean, it's an absolute. Well, this is obviously the WordPress, so they can come and check out your blog. You admitted up front, it's kind of a classical blog, nothing fancy smancy, but it does cover a lot of cool stuff. They should check that out for sure. And then come on over here and get you a couple books. You might as well get involved, because I'm going to be getting more involved in this content, and I'm going to be baptizing myself in this material on purpose, because if I'm going to come out here on MythVision and continue to talk about these things, I need to know the latest and greatest up-to-date content when it comes to this material. And you engage in so many of the scholarship that I've actually discussed. I highly recommend everybody to go check that out. So make sure you do that down in the description. I seriously appreciate you on this, Dr. Litwa. Let's do this again.
Well, thank you, Derek. It's been great talking with you.
You too. And ladies and gentlemen, if you're lost and you're looking to rise from the dead, don't worry. You can do it right here, because we are MythVision.